Guys, there's someone I want you to meet. His name is Josh, and he does a podcast called Combat Learning. And he has all kinds of fascinating things to say that will improve the way you do your martial arts training. Hey, I've never done an interview before, so this first one, I'm a little bit of a dingus, kind of like when you have your first sparring match. But I want you to check it out so you can learn about Josh and what he does on his podcast. Take a look.
Well, hello everyone. You guys know me. I'm Paul Van Squike from Taekwondo Guide, and I have with me today Josh. Josh, do you want to introduce yourself so people know a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, sure. So I run the Combat Learning podcast, which is a podcast that exclusively explores training methodology, scientific training methodology rather, for combat sports. And the sort of theoretical bend I come from is called ecological dynamics, and the constraints-led approach, which is like a practical, I guess, philosophy of how to actionalize all the heady concepts of ecological dynamics into something that's you can actually coach with. My background is in Taekwondo, and it's not something I did as a kid and quit. It's something I kept doing. I used to teach it professionally, and I actually have plans to coach again. So I'm not done with it. I've done a lot of other martial arts. The last few years, I've done a lot of jujitsu. So what I practice weekly right now is more jujitsu than Taekwondo, but not forever. And I guess since Taekwondo people, they always want to know your rank. I'm recently promoted to 5th Dan, so
Oh, very
that's my
nice.
rank. You can't question me anymore because I'm 5th Dan and higher than that. Just kidding.
No, it's
Just
funny you
kidding.
say that. I've been going through your podcast, and I just realized like I'm 2 years in the past for wherever you're at with things.
Yeah.
So it sounds
Yeah.
like you're not currently teaching Taekwondo, but you just that promotion's pretty recent, then, isn't it?
Yeah, I've been a 4th Dan all the way up until the like it was a I just now got promoted, like well, I don't know the exact date, but I'll look at the thing when it arrives, but yeah.
Very nice. Well, found you just because you left a comment on one of my videos, and I'm like, man, this guy's got some smart stuff to say. And I clicked on your channel, and then lo and behold, you have this whole podcast, which I really recommend people check out. But as I started to dig in, I'm seeing that you are giving terms to some stuff that I think a lot of us play with, and I had no idea that there was this whole academic background to these things. So you did a little bit already, but I know, like, I've got a list here, some of the terms you commonly use. You have the term motor learning, the constraints-led approach, ecological dynamics. Do you want to go into defining some of those things so that if
Sure.
you use them down the road here, people know what it is that you mean by those?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start with the ones that are probably the easiest to explain first and that are used by everyone. It doesn't matter like whatever theoretical framework you come from. So that motor learning, motor learning is the processes that underlie acquiring skilled movement, motor skills. So the trick about learning and motor learning is that we often speak of learning in terms that are very colloquial and are contradictory. So we'll say, we learned of something, and we mean that we discovered that, right? You didn't necessarily, there's no change that happened. There's no skill that was acquired at that point, but you discovered it. We'll say that that we memorized information, and we'll say that we learned that information. We'll say this in school often. We memorized our biology, this chapter of biology for the test or something. We'll say we learned those things. But learning, as defined in the field of psychology and skill acquisition and related disciplines, is a relatively permanent change in behavior associated with experience, practice, and or training. So if there is not a stable change in the way, a stable change in the sense of a stable improvement, in the way that you are able to use thoughts or behave or anything like that, then it's not really learning. There's no change really.
Now, does that have to do at all with
Place.
the part of the brain involved in the action? Like, I don't know the specific brain parts, but we think in terms of conscious and unconscious. And if you've truly learned something, is there a part of the brain represented like that for the unconscious that really gets that concept, whereas it's different from just being consciously aware of it?
I do think is different than simply being consciously aware of it. In terms of which part of the brain, I think learning is distributed throughout the entire body. You can even think of, so it's not in the, learning is not chiefly in the brain. The brain is an important part of that.
Mm-hmm.
But learning is is everywhere in the body. Because there's a conditioning effect that happens to your muscles, your tendons, and to your nervous system, which is not just in your brain, but also throughout your spinal column and the rest of your body. The sensory organs, all of these things, they sort of work together to improve how they coordinate with one another, and that helps you to behave in a more skilled way. So when people they
Yeah.
get so skilled at something that they experience what they think of as an automatic behavior, that's really your whole body is so good at communicating between the different subsystems that it can coordinate responses and actions without you really thinking about it, and it just feels like you're just moving.
That's really interesting. That's a much more holistic way of thinking about it than the model
Mm-hmm.
that I have in my head right now. So I
Yeah.
really like that. That's really neat. Um, and yeah, you talk about it, the movement already being kind of, what's a good way to say it? I always thought that like if you could put someone in a suit and take them through a movement, they would understand it a lot faster than if you're just trying to explain it to them. And it sounds like there's an element of that in what you're saying, in that you're helping the person discover the movement through their own system rather than
Mm-hmm.
through this sort of intellectual concept. Is that at all a right way of thinking about it, or is that a little off?
In terms of helping them discover it, sure. In terms of reproducing it, like sticking you in a suit that moves exactly like you, they would be rediscovering in part, they would be rediscovering your way of
Mm-hmm.
experience it more so than their way. Not entirely, because they're still experiencing the movement, but the movements are not produced by them. And the movements are not produced by their nervous system and their perceptual system. So there's going to be there's going to be information lost, and they might not be focused on the things that they need to be focused on in order to produce a, I guess, a comparably functional movement solution. It depends on whether you're talking about pumse or sparring, though, in
Sure,
that
sure. Yeah,
situation.
that's one of the questions I do want to get into. But
Hmm.
yeah, I guess from the standpoint of just reproducing a textbook sort of technique.
Hmm.
But yeah, so you've talked about an internal versus external approach to learning a movement. So in this case, if you're thinking of the person in terms of just accomplishing something, like say you want them to hit a target, the focus you would try to get them to key into is external rather than internal, correct? In that you're trying to
Hmm.
get them to get the results rather than shape their body a particular way. Is that correct in my understanding, or?
Yes. So
Okay.
with dynamic skills like sparring, for sure, and probably things like board breaking, and I guess some people compete with that, but
Right.
uh, some people do. I mean, there's big karate tournaments where guys are breaking like 4 blocks of ice in a row or something. So I
Right,
thought
right.
that might
Yeah.
be helpful for them. For Pumse, you acquiring good you want to actually do textbook technique for Poomsae, right? Because that's the kind of the purpose.
Right, right.
So you can kind of help people acquire that with an external focus of attention. But in terms of being able to execute Poomsae really in a really skilled way, no matter where you are, an internal focus of attention is probably helpful for that. So it would probably help to kind of unpack what those terms mean. So an
Yeah,
external
okay.
focus of attention is when your attention is focused on something outside of your body to organize toward, usually in terms of a task. So if you wanted to kick a field goal, an external focus of attention would be drive the foot through the bottom of the ball. Now I do reference the foot there because that's the part being used, but the focus is on a part on the ball, right? So that's the focus of the task. An internal focus of attention is where your attention is primarily focused on how you coordinate your body, how it moves, even how it feels internally. So like internal martial arts and Chinese martial arts, they're really all about like how does it feel inside the body? How do you know how exactly are your limbs aligned? And
Mm-hmm.
so if I were to give an internal cue for kicking the ball, I might reference the ball, but I'm going to be talking about like where on the foot, the angle of the knee. I might even talk in terms of the timing of what part of the body moves first in the coordination chain and then which part of the body moves last in the coordination chain. I've been guilty of this with teaching kicking because I took a look at how I kicked because I was like, well, my masters say I can kick well. So I'm looking at what I do and then I'm trying to explain it and replicate it in other people. But not everyone kicks exactly the same. They don't, tense and slack their muscles at exactly the same points or in exactly the same order. Um, but more importantly, when you teach in those terms, Gabrielle Wolf and her colleagues have, I think, very decisively proven this is a massive literature that's very well done. They've proven that an internal focus of intention immediately diminishes control. So that your immediate ability to produce a skilled behavior is diminished. And it affects the long term, the learning aspect, the long term performance of it. So you continue to have a diminished um, ability to control. Now that's not permanent. Like everyone, we've all been brought up to think in terms of internal focus of attention, and we eventually got skilled
Mm-hmm.
at producing the movements. And that's just because the human body is incredible. It's incredibly designed, and it will learn and become skilled despite bad training methods. Despite it.
Yeah, it's so funny to hear this because, like, I think of the Bruce Lee line where he goes, "Don't think, feel," and it's kind
Hmm.
of just along those lines. It's a little bit more simplistic,
Hmm.
and I don't want to get too far into the weeds, but it's funny how you've mentioned this, and I think it's absolutely the case. If you're not teaching in that sort of breakdown of a kinetic chain, then I think a lot of onlookers might not view you as a capable instructor. So one of my questions was actually like, how can you educate say if you're teaching kids, educate the parents so that they understand your approach and don't think you're missing this giant piece of the puzzle when you're instructing.
Mm. Yeah, so upfront communication is really important, and then a little bit of explanation when you do things that might seem off kilter is really important. So upfront, I've been told by coaches and instructors that using scientific terms is going to work against me, and if
Mm,
you use too many, that's true. But I come from a marketing background. I'm not a neuro-linguistic programmer, but that that those type of people and that methodology of like trying to like trick people into buying things, there is an underlying psychology like a sound psychological explanation for why some of those things work. And what the funny thing about neurolinguistic programming is that the term neurolinguistic programming is neurolinguistic programming. There's nothing scientific about NLP in terms of like research or underlying processes. But the reason why it has such a dazzling sounding name is because people who come across it immediately assign it a sort of veneer of scientific value or intellectual value. And so you should not communicate primarily in terms of words that your parents and students are not familiar with, but letting them know, hey, I use the constraints-led approach to motor learning. Here's what these two things mean. Here's what you can expect, and here's why we do these things. It's going to look like I'm neglecting your child in terms of instruction.
Right.
But I'm operating on these scientific papers, on this theory of behavior, ecological dynamics. And even though it seems unintuitive, here's what the findings have been. And I have found these to be the case on my mat, right? Now, one or two people that might say that they're cool up front and then they have a fit about it later and you
Yeah.
know, leave in a huff and go down the street to your competitor, and that's fine. They can your competitor is probably a bottom feeder and is totally happy to have difficult members. Your life has been made easier, guys. Don't worry about it. But yeah, I think it's not as complicated as people might think it is. I know that my friend Scott Seavright, he runs an MMA gym in Milwaukee. He's done a great job of this. Coach Greg Souders, jiu-jitsu coach in Maryland, has done a fantastic job of this as well. And so both of them, they have a way that they introduce people to the basic concept. And then as their members become more advanced and they become more interested in the methodology itself, then they will start to introduce their students to some of the more heady stuff, some of the more complicated terms, some of the different things that underlie it. And some of the terms, like we talk a lot in terms of variability. Variability is certainly, it has a technical usage, but even the technical usage is pretty intuitive. We speak of variability in different senses. So like your ability to organize your limbs in different ways to achieve the same goal, right? There's more than one way to score on the Hogu.
Mm-hmm.
Do it with a straight punch. You can do it with a many variety of kicks. And that's an example of variability. There's different ways to throw the same thing that we would identify as a round kick. There's different ways to throw that, different angles, different launch parts, different, foot forward, foot back, jumping, all that kind of stuff. That's variability. And there's variability happening inside of your body because of the way that your organs and your nervous system and all of your perceptual system and your physiological system, they all interact with each other. They never quite produce exactly the same move twice. That's not super hard to understand. What's unique is that in traditional martial arts and basically almost everywhere in life, we've been conditioned to think that variability is bad. When in fact it's variability is a part of how we actually perceive better, and it's a part of how we become more skilled. It's a part of even how we protect ourselves from injury, especially overuse injury.
It's interesting talking about variability. That has probably been the biggest shock for me going through your stuff. So much of it was like an immediate, yeah, oh, I get that. I'm on board with it. In terms of teaching through a concept, like giving someone a feeling rather than a breakdown, and in terms of using the environment to shape what you want from a student. I'm like, yeah, obviously that makes so much sense. But then this variability concept, I had no idea that the human mind learns better by just kind of having a class that I want you to jump in if I have this wrong, but it sounds like you like my approach to a class has always been to onboard a concept and kind of take it like a train ride where I'm doing a piece and then I add another piece and another piece and eventually I get them through the whole concept. But it sounds like it might be better to sprinkle a whole variety of different techniques into the class and switch from one thing to an entirely different thing, and that's actually a better way for the human mind to learn a concept. Is that right?
Yeah, broadly, I think that's right. And there's another, so I'm a constraints-led approach guy, but there's another popular, I guess you could say a non-linear type of learning that's
Uh-huh.
known as differential learning. And it's called differential because differential is like a difference between different objects. And so the purpose of differential learning and in the variability within the constraints-led approach is for you to sort of context switch and to find information for movement, information for control, that's we'll probably have to unpack that, but it helps you immediately identify what you need from the environment in order to act in a skillful and intelligent way.
Hmm.
And it is interesting that if you can begin with a topic, a theme, or a concept and build a class around it, but the variability might look a little bit different. So you could do a class where you literally just hit every part of the game and it's just lots of randomness, but you're trying to hit every part of Olympic sparring. You do clinch stuff, you do distance management, you do cut kicking stuff, you do all the major parts of the Olympic sparring game. Or you could organize a class in terms of distance management, and then the variability aspect of the distance management would be just all kinds of different scenarios to use distance management from. And you
Hmm.
could still use the different ranges of Olympic sparring to organize it that way, such as, scoring range and long range and cut range and clinch and all that kind of stuff. So you could even throw a donor sport in there and do a little bit of sport karate. Um, the sky is the limit as long as the activities you're doing have sufficient overlap in the task, the information and task space that you need to perform in the real game, the actual match, the performance environment. That's called representative learning design. But
And that's
I should probably talk about ecological dynamics a little more.
okay, sure, yeah, because
Yeah.
that's outside of the constraints-led approach then, what you just described.
It's the theory that supports the constraints-led approach.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So the
Yeah, go
constraints-led
ahead.
approach is
You can
built on
steer.
ecological. Yep.
Yeah, yeah.
So the ecological dynamics is a theory of learning, of perception, of behavior. Most motor learning theories, so the most dominant one for probably the last 150, 200 years has been information processing. It has many forms. And information processing is basically this idea that the information in the environment is is impoverished. It's not structured or usable to you as it is ingested into your perceptual organs. So what your body has to do, rather your brain has to do, is it has to develop models to take that sense data and organize it, sort of remediate it through a series of processes like you might do in a spreadsheet, and make that usable and actionable. And so this evolves into a computer analogy to how the brain works and how skilled behavior works. So in order to do a round kick, you have to do the round kick with no target. You have to know all the biomechanics and everything. And then you move to the target, and then you move to like static drilling, dead drilling. And then eventually, somewhere along the way, 20 years later, you end up in sparring match where it all breaks and where it all breaks and you basically start over again. Don't lie. Everybody's had this experience.
Right.
Don't
Yep.
lie, dude. Stop it. Where it eventually breaks and then the real learning happens, in my opinion. What the ecological dynamic says is the information is actually usable to you. Now, that's not to say that you can perfectly perceive everything you need, that you can perfectly act upon it. It is a relationship between you and your environment, and that relationship improves in the same way that a friendship might improve or a marriage might improve. You learn more about the other person. You learn more about how they think, how they feel, what their emotional buttons are, what makes them feel better, those sorts of things. And so your perceptual system works kind of like a radio set. It's trying to find signals for useful information that you can use to pair your actions to, your movements. And as you get better at, we call it attunement, so attuning to those pieces of information, you get good at removing the static and finding the signals. And there's lots of signals that are useful, but some signals are more useful than others. So when we talk about differential learning and the variability within the constraints-led approach, if you only practice, for example, like a clinch or something, and you don't pull in other aspects of the Taekwondo games, just like, well, I need this student to get better at clinching, so we're just going to do clinching this entire class, or we're just going to do clinching for the next week or two. That feels intelligent. It feels like we're drilling down. But clinching, especially in Taekwondo, is a very quick, transient thing.
Mm-hmm.
There is a before clinching, which is really important because how you position yourself is going to set you up to whether or not you can be scored upon or scored from the clinch. So whether or not you're safe, you miss opportunities to score in the clinch with punches and short kicks. And there's an after to clinching. So if the ref doesn't break you up, there's a way to safely remove yourself from the clinch and continue to play where you might actually even be able to score, but you're also in danger of being scored upon. So if all you do is stuff from clinch without that broader context in there, they're going to get real good at that clinching game. And you're going to be like, wow, these guys are getting good at clinching in Taekwondo. They're not getting bowled over. They're not doing these, they're not getting hit by these quasi takedowns. And you know what? They're doing good at not being scored upon in the clinch. But as soon as you stick them in a match, they have trouble finding the clinch. They have trouble safely exiting the clinch, or they don't ever safely exit the clinch because because it's just not something that feels available or safe to them. And so you have a false positive there because the signals that they have learned to attune to, like a radio set in that specific practice environment, are not applicable throughout the phases of the Olympic Taekwondo game. And so if you want to get better in the clinch, you should do a just clinching game, but never stay there. So when we're talking about variability, you've got to add in more context. You've got to progressively reintegrate it into the broader game because you want them to find signals that are useful to them across situations, across problems, so that they're not trying to switch between almost entirely different contexts and signals when they switch from situation to situation, because sparring is really fast. And so if you try to do something like the constraints-led approach and you're not aware of that, you could get frustrated and think it doesn't work because you're not aware of actually how the constraints-led approach works, or actually more specifically how our theory of human behavior works, right? As grounded in the literature.
So if you were interested in trying this approach, what would be a good jumping off point, something to sink your teeth into just to start, getting an idea for how it works?
Yeah. So Dr. Rob Gray, he has an excellent podcast, Perception Action Podcast. I would listen to that, but I wouldn't necessarily start there. He wrote a book called How We Learn to Move. How We Learn to Move. That is an excellent introduction to how the things sort of work. That's very accessible. There's not a lot in there in terms of how to use the constraints-led approach, but thankfully he wrote a follow-up book called Learning to Optimize Movement, and that goes into a little more detail. I actually started the Combat Learning podcast 4 years ago, so some of this stuff might be 4 years old. I've changed a lot since then.
Right,
But
right.
since I started that, I've moved more into an educator role, and I've begun producing a lot of resources on this. So you can join my free email list. Go to combatlearning.com. There's no specific page anymore. It should just hit you with the do you want to subscribe to the email newsletter. I have an introduction to motor learning for martial arts as a PDF that goes through some of the basic, like what's the definition of motor learning, motor control, things like open and closed skills, right? That's an important distinction to know why you can't train Pumse and sparring the same way and get good results in both. And I also have what I call a transfer cheat sheet, which is kind of a very quick and dirty list of principles of how to design your sparring activities in a way that are most likely to yield actual improvement in a tournament, like in a match, or if you just like to spar for exercise in your sparring rounds. That's all available to you. And then I've just written all kinds of other stuff that's useful on the website, that's freely available for everyone. I just yesterday, or this morning rather, early this morning, I published a quick reference guide to ecological terms that we use, because the
Yeah, I
language
just saw that. Yeah.
the language is difficult. I understand that the language is difficult for people just getting into it, and we use different language than like information processing people use, and it's just it's a quagmire, and it took me years to untangle everything. So I'm trying to help clarify that up front for everybody else so they don't have to read everything and figure it out.
Sure, sure.
Yeah.
Now you didn't jump in with this information, so where was the turning point for you where you thought, okay, this is the right way to go. The way that I've been learning is not the way to teach the future generations of Taekwondo students.
Yeah, so there's an interesting confluence of events. So I was the chief instructor of a Korean martial arts school. It's a Tang Sudo school. I taught Tang Sudo at that time. I'd practiced a little bit of it, but I'm a Taekwondo person. I'm not ranked in Tang Sudo. And that closed down. And so I still wanted to teach. I'd always wanted my own school. So a bunch of students followed me to a little Lutheran church that I taught out of. And for about a year, I taught them, and I had full reign to do whatever I wanted. So I started being very creative and experimenting with things. And it's around that time that I started a Master of Education in Teaching and Learning. And I came across this term motor learning. And so I started very slowly and progressively looking at different articles on motor learning. Then I found Perception Action Podcast. And Perception Action Podcast is about the time, that was about the turning point, because he was talking about the variability stuff. He was talking about focus of attention and self-organization. And that's when I realized, okay, I don't understand how this works, but I can imagine that there is a way to help people become skilled at martial arts without inundating them with tons of explicit instruction and static drilling. And so that was a several year process. This is probably 3 or 4 years before I finally started combat learning. And then it's been 4 years since I started combat learning. So it's been, I don't know, I think it's in 8 years since I first started studying motor learning specifically. But I did, there is one moment when I was still teaching. It's towards the end of my time teaching by myself on my own. And I was like, you know what? We've always taught wrist locks, A, B, C, D, 12 months of material, maybe even longer. You have to learn the different ways to do same side, cross hand, both hand, 2-on-1, all that stuff. And all the different Hapkido releases and stuff. They're all separate, right? They come maybe in
Right, right.
pairs, things like that. So it's all separate. And I thought, you know what? Why don't I just give them a set of task parameters, like game rules about these were the game rules. This player has to maintain control of both wrists or at least one. So you start with control of both wrists, and you have to be successful, you have to maintain a grip on at least one wrist. So even if you lose one, you can double up on the other, or you can switch, whatever. The other player has to break the grips on both. That's their success. That's their way of succeeding at the game. And so I gave that to kids. I let them go. And lo and behold, to my surprise, they are doing all the different circling and finding where the weak point between the thumb and the finger and all that stuff. They're finding that without instruction. They're performing far better than they did with the drilling and all that kind of stuff. And they're getting better. They just like in like 5 minutes of play, they're better than like a year of the one step Hoshin Sul type of training. I was like, well, that's how can I make this work elsewhere? That was my thought. Is like, how can I make this work with all the other skills that I try to teach through techniques?
Right, right.
Yeah, that was
And
the
that's so
dominant one.
interesting because I always felt teaching all those different releases, and then you've pointed out how someone would grab a kid outside of class just goofing around or whatever, and,
Yep.
and the skill would be gone. And I'm like,
Total
here
freeze.
I'm labeling these things self-defense techniques, and yet I feel like they're not going to have any access to these tools in a heated situation. So I stripped the curriculum of that stuff just because I felt like it was such a disservice. But it's fascinating having these simple games you can play that accomplish the result you're looking for in way less time. What I am curious about from an instructor standpoint, so we label all these sorts of releases. Is there any benefit to, as a teacher, having those labels in your mind? Because let's say I learned through this intuitive approach. So I played the game a lot and I got really good at popping out of different holds, but I had no sort of what do I want to say? I guess conscious awareness of the different angles and vectors I was using to escape. So I couldn't teach a technical breakdown, but maybe I could teach the drill. So do you think it matters that an instructor has sort of a catalog of techniques in their head at all, or is it more about having the right drills to give people?
Yeah, I don't think it matters that they have a catalog of techniques. It is useful to know certain aspects of the skill. So instead of 6 different ways to make a circle to break the wrist hold, and potentially 3 or 4 of those are actually like turning it into a wrist lock or something. Being aware of how you use the rotational force to break it is very useful, because there's a difference between putting pressure on the wrist and breaking it between the fingers. Those are meaningfully different mechanics. And you can actually combine the both sometimes, right? You might make a circle inside, and then you find the forefinger here, you find that and pull it out. To be aware of the ways in which it breaks might be useful for something, but for the most part, you need to give them the task and let them work with it.
Mm-hmm.
And then after that, integrate that task into whatever the broader objective is. So if you're teaching self-defense to children, and you want them to break break a hold that's probably be putting on them by a bully that's trying to make them do something. First of all, you need more than just how to break out. You probably need them to be able to withstand being dragged or something, right? And that's
Sure.
potentially useful to a predator situation. Although a predator is probably more likely just to grab you around the midsection, carry you off, but have more there, like maintaining distance after the fact, potentially talking to the bully before it escalates to that point, or setting physical boundaries before they start messing around with your wrists and stuff. Those are all important things to sort of integrate into that practice, and not just the wrist grabbing. The idea that teaching a single skill in isolation, that you can trust it to emerge when it needs to, is simply false. It is simply false. And we all know it's true, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we choose to focus on the 1 or 2 times across hundreds of students that we've worked with, many of whom have been bullied in some way or another. We choose to focus on the 1 or 2 instances that we've been told, so-and-so did this to me, I did the karate technique and it worked, blah, 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 right? We focused on the 2 times it works and ignored all the other times where students froze and didn't use it, or failed to set boundaries, or failed to get away, or talk to a teacher, any of these things that we also talk about. We statistically, in terms of the data that we have, we know it doesn't work that well, but we choose to focus on the few times it worked, because otherwise we don't know how else to do it, right?
Right.
And we're not going to go read a bunch of academic papers. We're not going to go try and actually find out why. Most of us anyways. That's
Sure.
sarcasm, but
Yeah, that makes teaching something like self-defense just inherently so much more difficult, and
yes.
then it's much harder to put that label on what you do
Mhm.
if you're being authentic about it.
Yeah. And that creates problem. I mean, I've made a lot of I don't want to say enemies, but antagonists, because what I've learned. So my interest in this was more for sport, but
Mm-hmm.
I've always had an interest in self-defense. And so what I've learned here, I just can't stay in my lane, because it applies just as much to self-defense. And so, a lot karate people and Taekwondo people, they like to position themselves in opposition to in opposition to sport, by saying, you know what, us traditional guys are actually the whole time we were reality-based self-defense. We
Right.
get it all. We get
Right.
it all from Pumse and Kata, because they knew everything back then. They knew all about it in the 1890s, whenever karate became conscious of itself. But they knew about everything back then. It's the ancient wisdom and all that. The kung fu movies type of idea of what martial arts is. And so, because it's for self-defense, we have to do groin strikes and eye pokes, and that's too dangerous. So we can't spar. And so you sport guys, if you train with those rules, that's just going to make you bad at self-defense. We train for self-defense. Now, granted, we're not allowed to continue. We're not allowed to make contact. We're not going to talk about all the rules. That we have more rules for how we train, actually. We can't talk about that at all, ever. But when you train under those rules, it's bad for you. When I train under a non-contact, highly scripted rule set of training, it doesn't matter. That's self-defense. This is all wrapped up in the identity of traditional martial artists who don't like sport. And after nearly a decade of communicating with these people and trying to make inroads, and having absolute minimal success, it has become clear to me that there is a mass level of insecurity, and you've talked about this in your videos.
Yeah.
I'm such a big fan. There's a mass level of self-deception and insecurity that underlies this, because if, and there's some big names that are towing these lines, if they were to come to the conclusion that they're wrong, we're talking 40, 50, 60 years of this that they're invested in, that they
Sure.
now potentially have to throw out the window. Now, I don't think that's wasted because it's exercise. It's fun. It's
Oh
aesthetic.
yeah. Right.
But kata has to be self-defense. It doesn't have worth to them if it's not fighting. If it's not serious defensive fighting, kata doesn't have worth to them. And I think that's just damaging. It's not true, and it's damaging. So I think there has to be there first has to be a blunt force instrument that causes a wedge between these sort of hidden nested ideas, because until people realize, actually, no, you could just do Pumse because you like it, that's
Right.
totally fine.
Right.
Like, Pumse has intrinsic value. I believe it does. I actually have a higher view of Pumse than the bunkai, bunkai heads that are
Uh-huh.
crazy about the practical applications and stuff, and they go around all over YouTube and say this would never work in this. You're not doing it properly. You don't know how to do you never. I'm sad that you were never taught the proper kata bunkai. You do Taekwondo, and it's just not the same. They don't know how to do applications. It's just got lost and watered down. We have to get to where that's embarrassing to say.
Yeah,
Like,
and if I had to, oh, sorry.
No, go
But
ahead.
if I had to guess, competition is so hard. Like I've only done, I think, 12 Taekwondo competitions. And that's not as hard as kickboxing or Muay Thai or something, where it's more variables at play. So it's something very difficult where you have black and white. Are you good at it or not? Are you winning or are you losing? And self-defense, there's no indicator as to whether or not you're good at it or not.
Yeah.
It's all kind of a theoretical thing. So it allows someone to be good and expert class without putting in any of the hard work. And I think that's the real driving force behind it, is that it gives you this ego boost of saying, yeah, I'm really good at this thing, but I don't ever have to actually prove that I can do any of it.
Right.
And so I don't know how you beat that, because it's sort of people just shortcutting to a status they don't necessarily have the right
ridicule.
to claim.
That's how you beat that.
Ridicule, yeah.
Ridicule. That's how you beat it. You don't have to be nasty about it, but you got to poke some fun, because when you can't reason with somebody, I call this concept ethical bullying. It's more like the way, did you have brothers growing up?
No, I'm an only child.
Oh, dang it.
So no
This might be
bullying.
alien. This might be alien to you.
Right.
I'm the oldest of 5 kids, but I have 3 of them are brothers. So 3 of my 4 siblings are brothers. And, brothers have a way of torturing each other that, while not always useful, does ultimately serve a pro-social function, right? We bug
Right.
each other to get rid of some of the worst parts of our personality, because we live together all the time and we rub each other the wrong way because we do annoying things to each other. And so you get among a friend of guys. This was really good for me growing up, because I was top dog among my siblings. I was the oldest. So I get in a group of peers, and there's this same dynamic going on, right? You get jabbed, you get insults or whatever. And if you're a sort of insecure nerd type, you're not going to like that. You're going to blow up, you're going to have a fit, and you're not going to fit in very well. But if you take it in the spirit it's supposed to be taken, you start to think, well, maybe there's some of these things I say and do, maybe I shouldn't do anymore. Like, maybe I shouldn't act this. Maybe I should stay in my lane within the social group. And then you put your time in, you earn their respect, you work your way up. They regard you a certain way, and lo and behold, you don't get picked on as much anymore. That's not to say bullying or all bullying is okay or pro-social. That certainly is not the case. But when you're among friends and you get laughed at or joked about because you did something legitimately annoying or stupid or something like that, you're probably going to stop doing this stupid thing. And so with changing the way people think about traditional martial arts, we've got to have the science, we've got to have the reasonable arguments and all that stuff there. But for the most entrenched, the most delusional, the most self-deceived people, the only way to deal with them is to basically laugh them off the stage, for lack of better terms. We have to poke fun at them. It's how do you respond to a joke if you can't, you know, take it in stride, right? A lot of these people can't really do that very well. So
Sure, sure.
they we poke fun at them, in a lighthearted way.
Well, that sounds like a good start, at least. It seems like that's been the shift of the culture for years now, and yet these things die very, very hard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so deeply entrenched. It's in the systems, it's in the institutions, the organizations, in the very fiber of the culture of traditional martial arts. This started as far back as Bruce Lee, and it certainly, if you look at some of the articles that were written around UFC 1 and the advent of Gracie Jiu-Jitsu and the martial arts consciousness, exactly the same arguments. Exactly the same arguments. Jiu-jitsu doesn't have the fish hooks and the groin strikes, and you don't want to be on the ground. You have to be on your feet and all this kind of stuff. It's literally all the same arguments back then. So that's 2, 3, 4 generations of teachers that have passed this down to people. And the type of people that stay in martial arts are not always, but usually, they are usually the guys who played the system. They excelled in the system. They take all the talking points and then they transmit those talking points to the next generation, all those different ways of thinking and those different ideas of how things work. Those are the type of people that tend to stay in martial arts. There's a few of us out here that are kind of mavericks. But there was a time when that was me, in my 20s, my early 20s, I was that way. In my teenage years, I was probably like the only thing that I didn't think was true was no touch knockout. Like I believed everything that
Mm-hmm.
people said about martial arts.
Well, it takes so long to navigate through all of it if you come up in the traditional channels, because you're told all of it, and it's like if you have to be very open-minded to be able to work your way out of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've spent tons of time going through all the books too, and
Mm-hmm.
all the pressure point stuff, and
Yeah.
some of the stuff you're like, this is so cool. I really want it to be true.
Pressure points is how I got into jiu-jitsu,
Oh,
because
uh-huh.
it wasn't a real fight. It was kind of a fight. Um, some dumb friend said something to another guy about me being a black belt, and I didn't advertise being a black belt. I didn't want to fight people. So it wasn't that kind of thing. But he's like, "Oh, that stuff won't work on me." And then he like did a takedown on me, right? Of course, I had no takedown defense because at this point I had no grappling experience except for Hapkido. Guys, Hapkido doesn't work for takedown defense. Sorry.
Didn't save you.
And Kenpo too, right? The Kenpo guys are gonna explode. Kenpo didn't work at that point. I'd done it for a year and it wasn't working.
Well, that's your fault, not Kempo's fault,
Yeah, of course. I didn't have the right set. I didn't know
Right.
the Raging Bull or whatever it's called.
Right, right.
So I tried to get up. He just held me there, right? It's a good thing it wasn't a real fight because he could have put me in the hospital easily. He just held me. And I knew pressure points and they worked in class, right?
Mhm.
Neck and shoulder and different solar plexus. They didn't work. They didn't work. Guess what he did when I found the pressure point? He just adjusted his head.
Yeah.
He tensed up the muscles and made it harder to access the nerve point.
Yeah, and I
And
imagine a lot of times they respond by hurting you more, if you
Exactly.
try something
Yeah.
that might be perceived as a little dirty, like
Yeah.
these people who say the eye gouge is the ultimate tool. You try to gouge an eye and maybe you hurt them a little bit, but they're in the dominant position. Well, now,
Hmm.
now you're in
Well,
big
people
trouble.
who don't spar actually don't realize how hard it is to access the head like that.
Sure, sure.
They don't understand the head's big. They don't understand. So let's say that you are a smaller opponent and weaker. What are what are the things that your larger, longer, stronger opponent have over you that could frustrate the eye gouge? Well, they have hands and arms, right?
Yeah.
They can address, you can hurt them and they can still address it and be functional. You're very, because that's reflexive, right? They can move backwards. That's another thing they can
Mm-hmm.
do.
Mm-hmm.
Your reach is smaller than theirs. They have longer legs than you. They have a longer torso. So they can address it. They can push you away. They can move backwards. They can move to the side. They can attack you while you're trying to do it. You can't control their head, guys. Sorry, unless they're on the ground or you have much longer hands than their head. This is very quick adjustments. This is like, you think of how your danger system is calibrated. It is calibrated to keep things off of your face and out of your eyes. It's one of the
Right.
quickest reflexes you have. Is it possible to do? Sure, it's possible to do, but there's another dimension to this other than the technical dynamic dimension of it, how hard it is to do in terms of skill. There's also the fact that it's disgusting.
Right, right.
And you don't necessarily incapacitate them. You just, especially if they're inebriated or on drugs or something, right? That's the other thing that Krav Maga guys are always talking about. Well, if I have to deal with somebody who's bigger, stronger, more athletic, larger, on steroids, drugged up, and drunk, then I want to stay on my feet and punch him in the nuts. Yeah, I don't think so. I don't think so. I don't even know if he'll feel it. He probably won't feel it, to be honest with you. Guys like that get tased and don't fall.
Yeah.
If six policemen are trying to like tase a dude who's 290 pounds and he won't fall, how are you going to deal with it? You weigh 100 pounds, uh, and you pretend to poke Bob's eye. I don't think you're prepared for that problem, guys. I think
Right,
we're going to have to
right.
recalibrate here.
Yeah, I'm curious about, I guess one of my hopes for the future and how the martial arts is viewed culturally is like if some people just don't like rough house practice, right? And so if you
Mhm.
drill things in any kind of live manner, they're just not going to stick with it. It's not for them. And so if they want to practice in other ways, like I don't have any problem with that. It's just you want to be realistic about what
Mhm.
the benefits are that you're getting from it. And I hope that if people are practicing in the more traditional ways that they develop a realistic idea of what it is they're getting
Yeah.
out of that, and then they can choose if they want to do that or do something that's a little bit more lively. But
Mhm.
at least go in and know what they're going to get from it.
Yeah, I'm pro anything that gets you exercising, and you can do martial arts any way you want to do martial arts. But when
Right,
you're talking
right.
about combatives, like actual self defense, the part of it that is combative and that prepares you for um, like antisocial violence, you don't get that without this sort of training. It's just, sorry guys, too bad.
Right, right.
Don't get it. You're not prepared. You can tell yourself whatever stories you want. In reality, you're not prepared. Now, if you want to train for self-defense and not do that, then you need to invest in verbal judo and situational awareness. Um, I'm not going to say a firearm because you have to have the combative skills for the firearms. Now, you can get
Yeah,
good
it's
at
this
shooting
whole
and
other
maybe,
thing.
yeah, it's a
Right.
totally different thing. You can get good at shooting, but you're not guaranteed to have distance between you and your opponent to access and use the firearm. So just however skilled you become with a firearm and drawing and all that kind of stuff. First of all, not everyone can do that. So if you're like in the UK, you can't just run around with a gun.
Yeah.
But you get entangled and guns get taken away all the time. It's all over CCTV and stuff. It's like guys who want to be, I'm all about analyzing CCTV and stuff, and this evidence-based self-defense where these guys build this cloud around themselves because they analyze all these real tapes of violence. There's certain things that they leave out, and it's how often people get their weapons wrestled away from them, good and bad. Good in situations where it was the bad guy who got his gun wrestled away or whatever. But if you're a young woman, and what like what is a young woman at most danger of in terms of violence? Well, intimate partner violence is the
Yeah,
top thing.
there you go.
So we're
Right.
talking about freezing. We're talking about a really difficult social, emotional situation to navigate. We're talking about a situation where she probably doesn't have a firearm, or if she does have a firearm, she has to now have the nerve to access and shoot somebody that she cares about, like a family member maybe, or somebody she knows. Like, come on, just buy a gun is not a solution to anything. I'm totally pro firearms. Like, if you can carry a firearm, get good at it, carry it, but it has to be integrated in your verbal self-defense, right? It has to be integrated with your ability to manage entanglement, grappling, striking, all of that stuff. You have to know all of that stuff if you really want to be prepared for self-defense. You have to know all of that stuff. You have to be skilled at all of that stuff. And spending 120 minutes a week of one steps and poomsae will never get you there ever, 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 ever. So if you're talking about self-defense, paying lip service to verbal judo and verbal, aikido, whatever you want to call it, de-escalation. No, you have to get a real program for everything. You have to practice it in realistic ways, and that's just there's no two ways about it. Sorry, guys.
Yeah, it's interesting too. Do you know any programs like that where you just deal with verbal de-escalation, that kind of stuff, or are those pretty much non-existent?
Only like professional training type of thing. Like you have to be in a hospital or a
Mm.
police organization. Verbal Judo International does it for police and healthcare and education. Crisis Prevention International does the same thing, and there's a couple other smaller ones. I actually wrote a program of my own,
Oh, did
and,
you?
and built a seminar or a workshop structure, kind of loosely based on the constraints-led approach. It's hard to apply to an academic setting, but um, because there isn't anything, there's nothing. We
Right,
pay lip service and offer one or two principles, and that's just doesn't cut it. I was
right.
a security officer, and so I worked in retail customer service, so you run into these things all the time. But especially as a security officer, I've talked to people who presented with violent intent towards me, um, and we're definitely not all there. So talking about somebody you can't really reason with. It's also called tactical communication. Police officers like to call it that. Verbal de-escalation is another common term for it, more for like, people that work in retail and healthcare and education. Uh, it is an entirely different way of communicating. The way that you communicate in everyday life is entirely different. It is ego driven. It's about not being mistreated. It's about jockeying for position. That type of communication that most of us engage in everyday life is inflammatory to somebody who's in an altered state of mind. Tactile communication is an entirely different way of thinking about communication and doing communication. You should invest in it because it will change your relationships forever. Um, but um, but it requires discipline. It requires discipline. It requires emotional control, which martial arts is supposed to teach, and it requires a lot of practice and a lot of. Right now, there's not a lot of training courses available to the public, so it also requires a lot of reading.
Sure.
So I recommend Verbal Judo. It's a little book. It's not long. The best. It's the best technical communication manual I've ever read. It's easy to read. It's great. Um, Concom by Sergeant Rory Miller is a good one too. It kind of goes into the background of like the different parts of the brain that are activated, different parts of a type of discourse that you're engaged in. It actually makes you aware of the types of discourses you're in. a lot of the times you get in an argument with someone and that ends in violence. It didn't have to. It didn't have to. That's like a form of social violence. It's because it went tit for tat, and this guy realized that he's going to lose social standing with somebody if he doesn't back up his thoughts or back up his what he said, and you didn't give him an out, and so that's why that violence occurred. Most of that stuff can be totally, like, probably upwards of 90% of any of that violence, which is what most people experience, is social violence, not
Right,
like a
right.
ninja jumping out and
You're right. Imagine that's pretty
the
unlikely.
throat
Yeah.
or mugging you or something. You know what I mean?
Right.
That happens, but it's very rare. And that is extremely difficult to deal with because situational awareness doesn't always help you with that stuff. But read Verbal Judo, read ConCom. There's another book. It's a little bit more complicated, but if you want to go deeper, The Gentle Art of Verbal Self-Defense is written by a linguist, a lady. That one's really useful too because it goes into specific types of registers and postures that you can take, and it helps you navigate that at work. Actually, it's specifically for how to talk tactically when you're navigating a professional environment. So those three books are highly recommended. But Verbal Judo is, like, if you're just going to read one, Verbal Judo's got to be it.
Well, that's good to know. Yeah, I've never heard of that book before, so that's a nice recommendation to have. Do you find that that's a perishable skill that you have to practice it regularly, or is it something you can put a chunk of time into and have it pretty well in place?
Um, I don't think it goes entirely away, but it does diminish.
Okay.
Yeah, and you have to learn to catch yourself because when you're in a conversation and you get I hesitate to say triggered, but you get like incited into something, push your button, you go
Right.
0 to 60 really fast. There has to be a buffer between your feelings and your expression at all times, and that can be very useful. Um, just managing relationships, working in customer service, all those sorts of things. Um, you have to cultivate that discipline, and I think that discipline, while it can erode, it never entirely goes away. So once you've cultivated it, is really a stable part of your personality, I think.
Very good. Well, I want to be respectful of your time. Is there anything else you wanted to cover? I know we've gone all over the place. You're the first person I've interviewed, so I'm like just firing all over, and it's like easier to talk to myself on camera. I'm not used to this dynamic, but um, you know. All I can say is I recommend your podcast so much because
Thank
it's
you.
a hard thing to wrap your head around if you're just hearing these ideas for the first time. And so being able to just listen for hours and hours and get those ideas repeated, it's given me a lot to chew on, and I've been trying to play with them in my classes. But is there anything else you want to hit on in terms of what you think might be good to get people started on this stuff?
Yeah, man, there's too many things. So I think what I'm going to hit you with is there is no such thing as a perfect technique.
Sure.
Get it out of your head. Textbook doesn't matter. What matters is if it worked, right? Now, if you're doing Poomsae, it's a little bit different, but in terms of self-defense, in terms of fighting, which is things we often talk about in martial arts, there is no perfect technique. I If you go to combatlearning.com, there should be a pinned post at the top that has that title. There is no perfect technique. I'm doing a companion series that takes Rob Gray's book that I recommended, How We Learn to Move, and I'm going chapter by chapter to summarize in different terms because that's a useful form of what we call repetition without repetition. It's a concept similar to disguised repetition, um, and then I apply it specifically to martial arts. Here's what it looks like. Because Rob Gray he works with all kinds of sports. His favorite sport's baseball, which is very different from martial arts. So you can go and read about that there. It's totally free. You don't have to be on the paid subscription for that article. But if you want to read the rest of the articles, you do have to upgrade. But there's a lot but beside that, there's far more free articles on my website than there are paid ones. And it's they're long, they're extensive, and I'm getting really good feedback on them. So if you're curious, head over to combatlearning.com and poke around.
Very good, very good. Well, thank you so much for joining me, Josh. I hope everyone has enjoyed this and that you've got something you maybe haven't heard of before to try learning about.
Yeah, man. Thank you for having me on, dude. I'm a big fan of the TKD Guide channel. I watch everything that comes out now.
Man, I'm so surprised, like I just started doing this kind of on a whim in terms of the Topic Tuesday stuff, and it's been great getting all the different interactions with it.
Hmm. Absolutely. I like how you take all of the usual questions that people ask. Every channel that ever I've listened to all these podcasts and channels that have come and gone. It's all the same questions, right? And you
Right,
don't
right.
answer any of them the way anybody else does. There's always a spin on it that's and that's what I enjoy about it. That's why I follow the channel. I was like, oh, okay, this is not the same.
Well, that's good to know. Thank you for the feedback there.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Definitely a fan. I recommend everyone stay subscribed. And if you're not subscribed yet, if you're maybe listening to this on my podcast, then go subscribe to TKD Guide on YouTube.
Very good, very good. Well, maybe this will be the first of many exchanges, but thank you again for your time. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me.